Milton Friedman was teaching economics at the University of Chicago. He believed economic shock therapy could encourage societies to accept a purer form of deregulated capitalism. In October 2008, in the midst of the biggest financial crisis since 1929, Naomi Klein went to the University of Chicago to talk about Milton Friedman.
When Milton Friedman turned 90, the Bush White House held a birthday party for him. And everyone made speeches, including George Bush. But there was a really good speech that was given by Donald Rumsfeld. My favorite quote in that speech from Rumsfeld is this. He said, "Milton is the embodiment of the truth that ideas have consequences." What I want to argue here is that the economic chaos that we're seeing right now on Wall Street and on Main Street and in Washington stems from many factors, of course, but among them are the ideas of Milton Friedman.
Friedman was a member of a group called the Mont Pelerin Society, led by the Austrian economist Friedrich von Hayek. They believed that if governments stopped providing services and stopped regulating markets, the economy would correct itself. In the 50s, they were seen as cranks, but over the last 30 years, their ideas have become the dominant economic doctrine.
The thesis of the shock doctrine is that we've been sold a fairy tale about how these radical policies have swept the globe. That they haven't swept the globe on the backs of freedom and democracy, but they have needed shocks, they have needed crises, they have needed states of emergencies. Milton Friedman understood the utility of crisis. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around.
It was in Chile that Friedman's disciples first learned how to exploit a large-scale shock or crisis.
Usually the official storytellers of neoliberalism, the official publicists, don't even mention Chile. They start the story with Thatcher and Reagan because it's much more flattering that way.
In the 50s and 60s, Chile's progressive developmental policies were a beacon in the region. The government invested in health, education and industry. American corporations were worried their investments would suffer. In response, the US State Department began sponsoring students from Chile and the rest of South America to study free market economics with Milton Friedman.
The University of Chicago had a joint arrangement with the Catholic University of Chile, under which a great many Chilean students came to the University of Chicago, were trained by us and received PhDs.
These students went back and taught in Chile. The Catholic University Economics Department in Santiago became a little Chicago school. Arnold Harberger, the economist in charge of the program, described himself as a seriously dedicated missionary. In 1970, Salvador Allende's Popular Unity government won the election on a platform of nationalization of large sectors of the economy. Chile's phone company was majority owned by the US corporation ITT. It spearheaded attempts to stop Allende becoming president. It had the support of Richard Nixon in the White House.
I was not there, but I can tell you what we now know to be a fact. He ordered the CIA to prevent Allende from assuming the presidency. And indeed, they tried to get me to lean on the Chilean military right after Allende was elected.
Despite the efforts of the CIA, Allende was sworn in as president. Richard Nixon ordered the CIA director to make the economy scream.
Señor Nixon es presidente de Estados Unidos, yo soy presidente de Chile. Yo no tendré un término despectivo contra el señor Nixon, mientras el señor Nixon respete al presidente de Chile.
Preparations began for the military coup. The Chilean Chicago boys started work on a 500-page economic blueprint called the BRIC. With US funding, everything was done to destabilize the economy. Truck drivers went on strike, bringing factories and shops to a standstill. There was a failed coup attempt on June the 29th, 1973. And then on September the 11th, with General Pinochet leading the army, the assault began on the presidential palace. Chile had enjoyed 41 years of uninterrupted, peaceful democratic rule. Now it was being violently overthrown. Pinochet and his supporters described the coup as a war. It was certainly designed to look like one. It was a Chilean precursor to shock and awe.
Fuerzas Armadas y de Orden, solo bajo la inspiración patriótica de sacar al país del caos que en forma aguda lo estaba precipitando el gobierno marxista de Salvador Allende.
The Chicago boys delivered their economic blueprint, the brick, to Pinochet. In the days that followed, more than 13,000 opponents were arrested and imprisoned. Thousands of prisoners were held in the National Stadium. Many were tortured. Chile became notorious around the world.
¿Cuántas personas?
At the beginning of November, 5,000 prisoners were released. The 900 they left behind were transferred to other detention centers. Less than a month later, FIFA allowed Chile to play a World Cup qualifier in the very same stadium. Their opponents, the Soviet Union, refused to play there, so Chile were allowed to score into an open goal and went through to the 1974 World Cup finals. With the population in shock, Pinochet imposed the policies recommended by the Chicago boys. Removal of price controls, the sale of state companies, the removal of import barriers and cuts to government expenditure. Friedman later openly acknowledged the importance of the Chilean experiment.
Here was a first case in which you had a movement toward communism, which was replaced by a movement toward free markets.
It didn't work. A year later, inflation was 375% per year, the highest in the world. So in March 1975, Arnold Harberger and Milton Friedman flew into Santiago.
He used a phrase that had never before been used in a real-world economic crisis. He called for shock treatment. He said that he was like a doctor that was going to help a country that was suffering an epidemic, and he was simply prescribing the medicine.
Friedman wrote that General Pinochet was sympathetically attracted to the idea of a shock treatment, but was clearly distressed at the temporary unemployment it might cause. It rapidly became clear that Friedman's economic policies benefited the wealthy at the expense of the poor. It was calculated that a family trying to live on the average wage had to spend 74% of its income on bread. Items such as bus fares or milk became luxuries, and Pinochet got rid of free milk in school, a move that echoed the controversial policy of the young education minister in Britain, who would later become his friend. In order to enforce these economic policies, there had to be an enemy to fear.
Tampoco creo yo que se haya triunfado totalmente sobre el marxismo. El marxismo es como un fantasma. Cuesta mucho tomarlo. Mejor dicho, no se puede tomar.
Friedman and Harberger argued that free market economics went hand in hand with freedom and democracy. But in Chile, where their ideas were being implemented within the context of a military dictatorship, the opposite was true. Many in Latin America saw a direct connection between the economic shocks that impoverished millions of people and the epidemic of torture inflicted on those who believed in a different kind of society. One of those was Orlando Letelier. Letelier had been Allende's ambassador in Washington. He spent a year in one of Pinochet's prisons before being exiled back to America. In 1976, Letelier wrote, "The economic plan has had to be enforced, and in the Chilean context, that could only be done by the killing of thousands, the establishment of concentration camps all over the country, and the jailing of more than 100,000 persons in 3 years." Less than a month later, Letelier was killed by a car bomb.
Good evening. A powerful bomb today tore through a car as it was driving along Washington's usually quiet Embassy Row. The Chilean was Orlando Letelier, who also had been foreign minister during the last months of the late Salvador Allende's Marxist regime. Richard Roth reports.
Michael Townley, a member of Pinochet's secret police, was behind the bombing. He'd entered the US on a false passport with the knowledge of the CIA.
Michael, buenas noches.
Buenas noches, Pablo.
La opinión del Poder Judicial chileno, ¿hay confianza en él?
Mire, yo confío plenamente en la justicia chilena, como patriota y luchador antimarxista y juntista por sobre todas las cosas.
Despite his confidence, Townley was extradited to the US and convicted of Letelier's murder. Pinochet ruled Chile as a military dictator for 17 years, but in a frank interview, Harberger remained in denial.
You cannot have a repressive government for long within a genuinely free economic system.
In the same year as Orlando Letelier's murder, Milton Friedman was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics.
You know, you people have such a distorted idea of what went on. Let me tell you some facts. Number one, I was offered 2 honorary degrees by universities in Chile before I went down. I refused to take them because those universities were being supported in part by public funds, and I did not want to appear in any way to provide any support to the political system in Chile. I'm not a representative of Chile. I'm not an advisor to Chile. I have no commitments to the government of Chile.
I now turn to you, Professor Milton Friedman. I am very sorry for this incident. It could have been worse.